Okay, so shalom, shaloha, and I'll give you the shaka, right? To start off. So I'm going to try and cover this in the next 30 minutes. People ask me how long is it going to be. We'll try and cover this in the next 30 minutes. Um, there's a lot to cover, but so I'm going to go through it, rather briefly, give the main points, and then we can stick around and go through more in more detail if you want. Can you guys hear me clearly?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Once again, you can put your questions in the chat, and I'll try and address them either while I'm talking, if I see them coming up, or afterwards. Okay, so why we're doing this today? Today is the Yartzeit, which is the Hebrew or the Yiddish for the anniversary of passing of a giant in the world of Kabbalah. So I'm going to just give you a quick rundown of the uniqueness of the day today and some of the bullet points that we're going to go through, and then we'll go into more of the detail. So obviously, we're going to talk about the Kabbalah of the Shaka, and I'm not going to get into a whole background of what is Kabbalah because that'll take us an hour just for itself. But just a few ideas of what is Kabbalah, um, the biblical, context for the Shaka. Some people are like, what? That's a biblical idea. That alone is surprising to many people. And then where this teaching comes from. The reason we're doing this teaching today is because today is the Yartzeit, the anniversary of passing of the Rebbe's father, whose name is Levi Yitzchok, Schneerson. And what I'm going to share today comes from his teachings, which I only became aware of myself, in recent years. And I've been fortunate to be part of a team that is translating these Kabbalistic teachings into English every single week. And I'm going to show you really briefly. The Rebbe's father was the chief rabbi of Yekaterinoslav, which is a city in Ukraine. Today it's called Dnepropetrovsk, or for short, it's called Dnieper. Dnieper is a major city in Ukraine. And in fact, fascinatingly enough, Dnieper has the biggest Jewish community center in the world, bigger than any community center in New York, London, Israel. Fascinating. So Dnieper where he was the chief rabbi, and he was exiled by the communist regime to Kazakhstan because he was such a force that stood up to the regime. They exiled him to Kazakhstan, to this little town called Chile. And in Chile, he had very few books with him. And they were so poor that he didn't even have money to buy paper and pen. And we're talking about a man who was a genius who could have written 50 books in his lifetime of novel Torah concepts. Guys, please mute yourself so we don't have background noise. And we'll have questions later. And so they're so poor that his wife would make ink out of flowers that she would collect in the fields, and she would grind up these flowers to make ink. And he would not have paper. He was so poor, they didn't have paper. What did he use? He used the margins of his books. So, every book has some white space around it, right? So the top, the sides, the margins of his books, he would use to write his ideas. At the time, nobody understood what he was writing because it was just him and his wife living in this middle of isolation in a middle of a hick town in Kazakhstan. And after he passed away, they smuggled out his books out of Russia, and these books eventually made their way to America, which itself is a miracle. Actually, my great uncle was one of the people who smuggled out one of the books. He was a Russian Jew who was also persecuted by the communists and was sat in prison. And when he left Russia, he took some of the books with him, specifically the Tanya book. And when they came to America, these books, and the Rebbe got them, the Rebbe wrote that he merited a wondrous, like a miracle, like a wondrous merit that his father's manuscripts reached him. And it took a few years until people deciphered these manuscripts and they were actually published. I'm going to show you real quickly a picture, and this is where the teachings are coming from. So this is a picture of the Zohar. The Zohar is the book of Kabbalah, the main book of Kabbalah, and you can see that the middle is the Zohar, the main book of Kabbalah. On the side is the handwriting notes of Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, where he writes in the margins. And I don't know if you can see it, but over here you'll see different colors. If you notice, I'm not sure if it's coming up in the Zoom, but on the side is red, on the top is black, and his teachings change colors because different flowers, different days, right? So one day there was red flowers, blue flowers, green flowers. The different ink changed colors. Fascinating. And the actual manuscripts, the original, is in the library exhibition in 770. If you go to New York, in Brooklyn, adjacent to 770 is a library that has the actual books that he had with him in exile in Kazakhstan, and where you can see the original manuscripts. It's fascinating. So when they were deciphered, the Rebbe started to refer to his father as the genius Kabbalist, not out of bias, but out of the fact that these mind-blowing teachings were coming out that nobody could fathom. And this is a man writing without any references. There was no internet where you could look up resources from memory, referencing Talmud, Kabbalah, just cross-referencing, and just mind-blowing stuff. So subsequently they were published. They were published in a series of books called Lekutei Levi Yitzchok, which means the collections of Levi Yitzchok. His name is Levi Yitzchok. And they basically just typed up all his manuscripts, all his writing, in just endless pages, right? Which are commentary on the Zohar, on the Kabbalah. Today we're going to look at maybe 5 lines of his teachings. Now, I was hoping to have a slideshow to go along with this, but in the absence of a slideshow, I'm going to hold up these different texts and show you them. So that's a little bit about Rabbi Levi Yitzchok. Again, we have 5 volumes of his teachings coming from these margins of his notes on the side of his books. Each few lines is pages in English, literally. Okay, guys, once again, if you can just mute yourselves so we don't have any background noise, I appreciate that. And so about 40 years ago is when it started coming out to the world. It started being deciphered. It was published in Hebrew. About 20 years ago, there was a man, Rabbi Dubov, who's a personal teacher and mentor and friend. He lives in Princeton, New Jersey. And he started the process of unpacking and deciphering the Rebbe's father's Kabbalistic writings. Now, the Rebbe himself would teach his father's writings on Shabbat at the gatherings, the Verbringens. The Rebbe would take a few lines and elaborate it and show the tremendous depth in his father's teachings. Most people couldn't understand what he was talking about. It was so deep. But again, it was in Yiddish, it was in Hebrew, right? And it was still very, very compact. In the last few years, there's a book called Yartzeit Levi Yitzchok al Torah, which is unpacking this Hebrew, but also in Hebrew. But he would take a few lines of the Rebbe's father's teachings, and he would explain it and bring references and footnotes again in Hebrew. About 5 years ago, this nonprofit organization that I worked for called Hayenu, which publishes a weekly Torah booklet, we started to do this in English. And this is because Rabbi Dubov would do a weekly video, which is on YouTube, where he would take a weekly thought from Rabbi Levi Yitzchok's teachings in Hebrew, and he would explain it on video. It's like a 5-minute video. Every week, a thought. And this was the first time it was actually coming out in English, but in audio and video. And Chayenu started translating them and transcribing them and writing them in text. And it comes out every single week in print to this day. If you're a subscriber of Chayenu, you can get the weekly teachings from Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, and you can see the teaching. So one of the weeks, a few years ago, we did this idea of it wasn't called the Shaka, because that's unique to Hawaii, but I'll give you the biblical concept in a minute. And last year, we printed in English for the first time gems from the Lekutei Levi Yitzchok, which is a translation of these Hebrew books collected from the teachings that were being published every single week. And I'm going to show you a picture we got from the archives of the library of the Tanya, again, Reb Levi Yitzchok's Tanya that he had with him in exile. And again, you can see on the margins, the notes that he penned on the margins, right, on top and the sides. So this is where it's coming from. And what we're going to learn today is literally a 3 or 4 line comment in the margins of his Zohar, of his book of Kabbalah that he wrote, explaining this concept. So now we know a little bit about where we're getting those teachings from, let's go to the actual idea. So it's fascinating that a lot of things there are some concepts in Hawaiian history and culture that have biblical parallels. There's a lot of theories. People want to say that the Hawaiian people are like one of the lost tribes. I've heard that theory, right? I haven't seen any concrete evidence of that genealogy, but there's these little interesting clues. Like we know that one of the things we'll talk about today is kahuna, right? Kahuna is like the priests, right? And in Hebrew, kahuna means the priesthood. The Kohen, we know that Kohen was the priest who worked in the temple. And the word, the noun of priesthood is kahuna. It's a Hebrew word. It's a biblical word, right? So you find in the Torah written many times, the Kohen and the kahuna. So it's fascinating that this is in the Hawaiian tradition. Another word is mana. Mana means divine energy, which we know was the food that the Jewish people ate in the desert that rained down from heaven was the manna, right? It was divine energy, right? So there's other things like they have this leper colonies, right? Molokai, there's like a leper colony, which in the Jewish tradition also the Metzora, the one who had leprosy, would be sent away in quarantine out of the camp. That cities of refuge concept, which is also a biblical concept. So it's fascinating study to see the parallels. So the Shaka, which is like the symbol of the aloha, is like the legends. Where does it come from? If you look it up on Google, if you search where does the Shaka come from, there's all kinds of theories. The Menehuni, there was a guy that had his fingers cut off, right? And when he waved to people, his wave was the Shaka because his fingers got cut off. So people were like copying him. So they would empathetically bend in their 3 fingers so that they could sort of be empathetic to the guy that lost his 3 middle fingers. I mean, that's one of the theories that goes around, and I'm not saying it didn't happen. Maybe it did happen, but there's definitely much more to it. And what we're going to learn today is not just a biblical source for this, but a Kabbalistic meaning and even an intention that when you do the Shaka, there's something profound that's actually happening. Now, I can guarantee you that the people that this happened to, even if say this guy did exist, and there's statues in different parts of the islands that have the Shaka symbol going back many years, it's irrelevant if the people and the culture know or knew any of this, what we're going to talk about today. It's irrelevant. And we'll give you another story from Reb Levi Yitzchok's life that is going to show you that regardless of the intention of how things develop, it doesn't take away from the fact that there can be layers and layers of meaning beyond that, whether it was conscious to the people that developed it or not in Hawaii. Here's an example from Reb Levi Yitzchok's life. Reb Levi Yitzchok, not only did he study Kabbalah, but he lived Kabbalah in his blood, in his veins, in his every breath. He lived it. It wasn't just an academic study. It was something that was literally the way he lived. And Kabbalah essentially is just in a 30-second nutshell. What is Kabbalah? Kabbalah is the mystical interpretation of the Torah, right? So the Torah has many levels of interpretation. There's what's called Pardes, which is the Hebrew word for paradise. Pardes means the orchard, but it also is a reference for the mystical. And Pardes is 4 letters. Like in English would be PRDS, would be the core letters of Pardes. So in Hebrew, Pei, Reish, Dalet, Samach stands for Pshat. It's an acronym, Pshat. Remez, Drush, Soid. The P or the Pei is Pshat, which means the simple level of learning Torah, the literal meaning. There was Abraham, there was Isaac, there was the story of there were shepherds, they went from here, they went there, the literal storyline. And then there's Remez, which is the allegory. things that are alluded to in the text, which are not on the surface, which is the world of gematria. Gematria is the numerology, so to speak, right? Gematria comes through geometry. Every word in Hebrew has a numerical value. We're going to talk about that soon. It's important to understand. So, for example, A, B, C would be 1, 2, 3, right? So the Aleph, which is the first letter, is 1. The Bet, right, which is where Alpha Beta comes from, is Aleph Bet. The first letter of the Hebrew alphabet is Aleph is 1, Bet is 2, Gimel is 3, Dalet is 4, etc. So every letter of the Hebrew alphabet has a numerical value. Rabbi Levi Yitzchok was very much into this. When you understand the number associated with every single word in Hebrew, you understand the coding of that word. And then when you see words that match up in numbers, you have an indication of parallels and themes. The meaning of if numbers line up, it's usually an indication that they have the same value. Now, value not just numerically, but value conceptually, ideologically, thematically. So I'll give you an example. The word, one of the names of God, right? There's many different names of God. We're going to talk about that in terms of the Shaka. One of the names of God, we don't say God's name in vain, so I'm not going to say it, I'm going to allude to it. One of the names of God is Elo dash him. I don't want to say God's name, but if you take out the dash, you'll get what I'm saying, right? Elo dash him, right? ELO dash HIM, right? So we substitute the H with a K so that we can say the name without saying the name, right? We don't want to say God's name in vain. So we're going to say Elokim, right? Elokim, if you take away the K and you put an H, you'll have the name of Hashem, right? So Elokim is one of the names of God. And if you look at the numbers, the Aleph is 1, the Lamed, which is like the L, right? The Lamed would be 30. The Hay, right? Instead of the K is the H. The Hay is 5. The Yud, which would be like the I, is 10. And the Mem, the M, is 40. Okay, so if you have 1, 30, 5, 10, and 40, what do we get to? 86, right? 86. Elokim, 86. The word for Hateva, which is nature, is also 86. Hey is 5, Tet is 9, Vez is 2, and Ayin is 70. So Elokim is the same gematria numbers as Hateva, as nature, which is fascinating. In the story of creation, the name which God creates the world with, the name is an expression, right? A name is not your essence, but it's an expression, right? It's how people refer to you. It's like your identity in a certain capacity. And there's different titles you can have. When a person has a title, like doctor, lawyer, it's not the essence of who they are. It's their title. It's a function. It's a role that they're playing, not their essence. So God's names in Kabbalah are different channels of expression. When God is, so to speak, expressing himself in compassion, he has one name. When he expresses himself in might and awe, he has another name. When it's, right, so chesed, which is kindness, is one expression. Harshness or severity or judgment is another expression. Elokim is typically connected with concealment, restraint, or some kind of a judgment. In fact, judges, in the biblical narrative, a judge actually called Elokim, right? Because they when they judge, they have to discipline. There's law and order. There's a certain restraint. The name Elokim is associated with restraint. Why is that connected with Teva, with nature? Because within nature, God is restraining his revelation. He's not revealing himself. A miracle is a revelation. You see the hand of God in a miracle. In nature, you have the illusion that there's just some sort of cycle of nature. That's why people can believe in nature and be like, there's no God. It's all Mother Nature, right? Because nature disguises godliness. So what I'm saying is important to understand, because we're going to get to it related to the Shaka. So when God creates the world, it says, Vayomer Elokim, and Elokim said, let there be light. Elokim said, let there be ocean, sky, animals, people. All 32 times in the story of creation, we come across the name Elokim. Why? Because the name Elokim is the same gematria, which is, again, gematria is the Hebrew for geometry, the same numerology as Hateva, which is nature. So nature is synonymous with the energy, the divine force of Elokim, because God is using a name, meaning an expression, which is also containing and hiding himself within nature. So there's a form of restraint in the divine revelation that comes through in nature to give you the illusion that there's just some kind of a system that goes on, that the sun rises and the wind blows and the waves happen. It just kind of happens. But really, it's not just happening. It's really Hashem is pulsating and animating the universe every single second, right? Now, what's another thing that's fascinating is that the divine name that is associated with revelation is, again, in English, it would be, if I had to use English letters, it would be YHVH, right? But we don't say Hashem's name. So it's a Yud, which was like an equivalent of a Y in English. So Hey is like a H, and a V is a Vav and a Hey, right? The divine four-letter name. Yud Hey and Vav Hey. In fancy English, called a tetragrammaton, right? For those of you that know those fancy biblical terms, but it's right, the four-letter name of Hashem. Now, again, we don't say it, unnecessarily. We don't say Hashem's name in vain. So what we do in Kabbalah and in Chassidus is we switch around the letters, just like we do with Elokim, where we substitute the H for a K, so we can say it without saying it. So Elokim instead of him. So with the name of Hashem, Yud, Hey, and Vav Hey, we switch it around to call it Havaya. This is going on for hundreds of years, referring to the name of Hashem by taking the letters of Yud Hey and Vav Hey and just sort of transposing those letters around to be Hey Vav Yud Hey. Havaya means bringing into existence, right? Which is essentially the name of Hashem. So it's fascinating that in Hawaii, the real way of saying Hawaii is Hawaii, right? That's the way the natives speak. They don't say Hawaii, they say Hawaii, right? The Rebbe was Russian. When the Rebbe spoke about Hawaii a few times, you have it on video, the Rebbe would say Havaya. He didn't say Hawaii, he would say Havaya, which is literally the way that the masters of Kabbalah would refer to the name of Hashem that animates the world as Havaya. So when I saw that and I heard it, it was mind-blowing because it says the Rebbe like understood that Hawaii is really Hawaii, and it's so similar to Havaya. There's a verse in Tehillim, in Psalms, where King David says, I'll say it in Hebrew. I think it's maybe chapter 66, I don't remember offhand. It says, Kashimcha Elikim, Kain Tehiloscha al Katzvei Eretz. Like your name, Elokim, similar to your name, Elokim, will be your praise at the ends of earth. Now we know that Hawaii is the ends of earth, right? We're the furthest, most isolated piece of land on earth. And King David says, like your name, Elokim, in other words, you can understand this as a variation of your name, Elokim, will be your praise at the ends of earth. What's the most commonly used phrase in Hawaii? Aloha, right? Aloha is, in Hebrew, Eloha is a variation of Elokim. In fact, if you take off the mem, right, the m at the end, the aleph, lamed, vav, hey is the core root of Elokim is aloha. So you have Havaya, Hawaii, which is very similar to the name of Hashem, which is the four-letter word Yud Hey Vav Hey, and you have Aloha. These are like the two core names of Hashem: is the divine name Yud Kei Vav Kei Havaya and Elokim, Aloha. So, okay, we're just again crash course Kabbalah 101, going through that very briefly. But the names of Hashem are expressions. So the name Havaya represents revelation. Whenever there's a miracle, right, or when God revealed himself, when God speaks to Moses in the Bible, it says Vayomer, right, Havaya El Moshe. And Havaya spoke to Moses because he's revealing himself. He's giving information. But in biblical narrative of creation, the name Elohim is used because God is creating and he's hiding himself in nature. Okay, you with me so far? Okay, so now we learned about the name Elohim, and that's going to be important to understanding the Shaka. Now, we were in the middle of talking about the four levels of interpretation of Torah, paradise, which is paradise, right? Paradise is the spectrum of Torah interpretation. So the four levels going back is pshat, is the simple meaning. Remez is the allegory, which is included as well is numerical combinations and parallels, like we just spoke about, the gematria. Then you have drush, which is homiletical interpretation, like midrash, where things also have allegory and deeper meaning. And then you have soid, which is the Kabbalah. So the soid, the Kabbalah is the secret. Soid means secret. Now, a little anecdote. Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, whose Yartzeit is today, where this teaching is coming from, he wrote a little, so to speak, bio, and it's printed in the beginning of his books. It's a little paragraph this big. And he speaks about his life in the last 5 years of his exile. And he talks about, fascinatingly, it's mind-blowing, how every single thing that happened to him in the last 5 years, remember, the communists are exiling him to a faraway place to get rid of him. They take the chief rabbi of the biggest city, or one of the biggest cities in Ukraine, they send him to this little tick town in Kazakhstan, and they get rid of him. And by the way, today in Kazakhstan, there's a major Chabad center in Almaty, where he passed away, in the town that he passes away. A huge campus. I was there a few years ago, and there's 8 centers of vibrant Jewish life in Kazakhstan. And right now, as we speak today, there's probably 150 Hasidim commemorating his life at his tomb. So it's amazing how the communist regime is long gone, and they try to get rid of him. And today there's like eight Chabads in Kazakhstan, and there's like hundreds. There's a charter flight went from Israel yesterday to Kazakhstan with 150 Hasidim to celebrate his life, which is still alive, very much alive in Almaty, where he was. So amazing how his teachings and his legacy are alive and well and kicking and growing every year. And and the communists are long gone. Anyway, so he writes, just towards the end of his life, he writes a little summary of the last few years of his exile. And he writes how everything that happened to him was aligned with Kabbalah. So like, why was he in exile for 5 years? Because Kabbalistically, the number 5 means this, and his name means that, and the Kabbalah of his name matches, and he was in this prison for this amount of days, and the amount of days he was in this prison adds up to this numerical value, and in Kabbalah it means this, and then they transferred him to the next prison, and Kabbalistically it means that, and he was in this city and that city, and the city where he was exiled means this, everything according to Kabbalah. Now you have to understand, the communists, they didn't care about even God. They didn't care about Torah. They didn't care about Kabbalah. So who's doing this? These anti-religious, evil people persecuting this holy Jew, and yet he sees within their actions the most unbelievable alignment with the deepest divine concepts of Kabbalah. How's that possible? How's that possible that these actions that are being done to him by these communists are aligned with Kabbalah, right? So it's fascinating because over here we see in his own life how no matter the intention of what's happening and the consciousness with which it's being executed, or the consciousness of a communist exiling this rabbi is of the lowest and worst nature, right? And yet he's reading into these things the deepest Kabbalistic interpretations. So it's like Moses standing in front of Pharaoh. Pharaoh is this evil, God-denying person who's persecuting the Jews, and Moses is standing opposite Pharaoh, and everything that happens in his perspective is the hand of Hashem, right? So you have these two worldviews. Pharaoh's living in one consciousness, in one world reality where there's no God. Moses is living in a consciousness where everything is happening is orchestrated by God, and they're interacting, and Moses' view of reality is 100% true, even if Pharaoh is not conscious of it, right? And Rabbi Levi Yitzchok demonstrates this, where regardless of the consciousness or lack of consciousness and awareness of even the existence of God on behalf of the communists that are persecuting him, putting him in prison and moving him from this prison to that prison and sending him in exile, he, as a Kabbalist, is able to see every single move because it comes ultimately from God, because everything happens in the world comes from God. He's able to see the hand of God within everything and how it's aligned with the deepest secrets of Kabbalah, and how what these communists are doing to him is aligned with the secrets of Kabbalah. So that's a window into what we're going to talk about. Who cares if the guy had his three fingers cut off? If it happened, if it's a legend, if he was a Menihuni, if he wasn't a Menihuni, if he drove a train in a sugar plantation, okay, it did happen. It didn't happen. It's a myth. It's whatever. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. The fact is, the fact is that this has become the symbol of Hawaii, of Aloha, right? And if there's one symbol of Hawaii, maybe besides for the plumeria flower in your ear or something, the symbol that people do on a daily basis, this is the symbol of Aloha, right? This has become the thing in a state of Hawaii, Hawaii. So the fact that this has become commonplace from a Kabbalist's perspective, if you put on the lens of Rabbi Levi Yitzchok, he put on his glasses, he would look into this in the Kabbalah and say, okay, this is fascinating. According to Kabbalah, this has tremendous meaning, regardless of the consciousness which brought it into place. Now, okay, that's just some of the background. Let's jump into the actual teaching. I want to show you a Chumash, okay, 5 books of Moses, and we're going to open up to page 609 in this particular edition, and you're going to see a picture. Let me try and line it up over here. I don't know how sharp the zoom is, but can you see that on the top corner there, okay, there's a picture of a guy doing a Shaka. Why am I bringing this to you? Because the kahuna, the priests, the kahuna in the temple, and we're talking about over 3,000 years ago, because the temple in Jerusalem, there were 2 temples, right, for a total of 830 years. Solomon's temple was 410 years. Then there was a destruction for 70 years and another temple for 420 years. So it was a combined 830 years the temple stood in Temple Mount in Jerusalem. But before that, there was this mobile temple in Shiloh, in Noiv, and Givain, and it all began with the mobile sanctuary which Moses created in the desert, which the same was basically a microcosm. It was the same idea, the same altar, the same sacrifices, the same Ark of the Covenant. The precursor to the temple in Jerusalem was the sanctuary, the tabernacle, the Mishkan that Moses created. So whatever the Torah says that they did in the Mishkan, in the sanctuary, is what they did in the temple, right? So we're talking about Moses' times, biblical times. And the verse over here says, I'm going to read it from Leviticus chapter 2, verse 2, talking about a meal offering of flour. There were animal sacrifices, there were wine libations, there were all kinds of things that happened on the altar. One of them says, I'll read it in Hebrew, I'll translate. They should bring this grain offering to Aaron, the Kohanim, the Kahuna, the descendants of the priesthood. And he should take a fistful, he should scoop out a fistful of flour to bring as an offering. So in Hebrew, the koimetz, every finger on your hand has another name, right? There's the index finger, there's the thumb, there's the pinky, right? So in Hebrew, this finger is called the koimetz, right? And this act of scooping something up is called a kmitza. Kmitza is the act of scooping something up. And the Talmud in the book of Menachos, page 11a, discusses how would the Kohen scoop up the flour. Again, the biblical narrative is that the Kohen, the Kahuna, would scoop up the flour in the pan, and he would scoop it up as an offering, okay? So he would take his hand, he would insert it into the flour, and he would scoop up the flour, and the Talmud discusses how would it work, and it says, they go back and forth, as the Talmud does. One rabbi says this, one rabbi says that, right? What's the tradition? And the consensus is that he would scoop it up with his entire hand, but then he would leave his 3 middle fingers closed in, and he would use his pinky and his thumb to wipe off, like I'm doing here. He would wipe off the edges so that there wouldn't be any flour sticking out, right? And all that was left was the folded 3 middle fingers, which gives you a Shaka sign. That's called in Hebrew the kmitza. And the Talmud is full of discussion of the Kemitza, or again, the Kometz is the name for this finger. But the Kemitza is the noun for this act. So this act in biblical narrative and Talmudic narrative is called the Kometz. Yes, Aaron was the brother of Moses. His children were, the sons of Aaron were the Kohanim, the priests. Again, feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I'll try and answer them with them if they're on topic. And if they're not, we'll talk about them at the end. So this, again, in biblical narrative, called the Kemitza, Kemitza, let's say, Kemitza, okay? And the Talmud specifically says that he takes the fist, and then he keeps his three fingers in, and he wipes off with his pinky and his thumb this excess flour, and you're left with that. And so that image is actually printed in Talmuds, in Talmudic books which have imagery. You'll see that picture. Again, the Talmud is over 1,700 years ago. You have you have Bibles that are printed in the Jewish world that have the pictures of the Kemitza, and it's a Jewish symbol that goes back literally before the Hawaiian people existed. Okay, I mean, if there's any Hawaiians on here, I don't want anyone to be offended, but actually, on the contrary, the Hawaiian people should be honored to understand that this has a biblical source. That this is not just something that came about from some random guy getting his fingers cut off. There's a deep. Now, let's talk about the Kabbalah of it. So now we know that the Kemitza is something that the Kahuna did in the temple for hundreds and hundreds of years. This was a sacred tradition. But what is the meaning of it? What is the meaning of it according to Kabbalah? So, remember we were learning before about the name of God, the name of Elokim, right? And the name of God is an expression of godliness. But which expression? We spoke about God expressing himself with compassion, with revelation, with restraint. Elokim is the name of God where there's restraint. There's gevura. Gevura can mean restraint. It can mean judgment. It can mean severity. Right? A judge is called Elokim. And when God is judging or restraining himself, that's the name of Elokim. The name Elokim has 5 letters. For those of you that know Hebrew, Aleph, Lamed, Hey, Yud, Mem. Right? Which would be the equivalent in English of Elhim, right? The 5 fingers of your hands are going to correspond to those letters. Aleph, Lamed, Hey, Yud, Mem. So Kabbalistically, the 5 fingers are Lo, and then H, M, right? Which I'm going to say is Elokim. As I said before, the K and the H are substituted, so we don't say Hashem's name in vain. So let's remember that. So if this is Elokim, if you're folding in the 3 middle ones, so you have now the Aleph, the A, and the E, and the Mem, right, are the ones that remain. And the 3 middle fingers, Elokim, right, are going to be Lamed, the L, the H, right, because it's really him, and the Yud, which would be like the I, so LHI equivalent, right? In Hebrew, the Lamed Hey Yud. So the Lamed Hey Yud are folded in, and only the Aleph and the Mem remain. Now, what does that mean? So again, this is Rabbi Levi Yitzchok talking about this based on Kabbalah, how the name of Hashem is the 5 fingers, and then when you're folding it in, you're bending those 3 letters in. So it's like a retraction. What's the idea? There's a Kabbalistic concept that is called Hamtokas Hadinim, which means sweetening the severity. Dinim, the word din means judgment or harshness or severity. And when something happens in the world that's apparently negative, right? The appearance of it, the expression of it is negative. Something terrible happens. There's a fire, there's a tragedy, there's something, harsh. So that's called din. Din is judgment. It means Hashem is operating in his name Elokim. There's something that's externally harsh. Now we know that ultimately everything that comes from Hashem is love. Everything that comes from Hashem is goodness. Right? Hashem is pure goodness, pure love. And we say that Hashem is Etzem HaToiv, the essence of good, and Teva HaToiv L'Heitiv, the nature of good is to do good. So we know that ultimately everything that comes from Hashem is good, right? Ein Ra Yored Milmaila, says there's no evil that descends from heaven. But we see tremendous negative in the world, right? There's so much evil. Seems like there's so much bad, right? So according to Kabbalah, and again, this is another whole class, but briefly, what appears to be evil, and we know this tremendous appearance of evil in the world. Like, look what's going on in the Middle East right now. Look what's going on, right, in 100 different places in the world. You don't have to look further than, your own local area. You'll see negative evil. But according to Kabbalah, all evil, right, is a mask and a husk, something that conceals godliness. But ultimately, there's a godly hand in everything. And if everything originates with God, there's got to be a kernel of good, right? And part of our efforts and challenge is to uncover the godliness in the world. And this is what Rabbi Levi was doing. Like here the communists are persecuting him and exiling him and punishing him and submitting him to torture. And here he's like seeing the hand of God in everything that they're doing and seeing how God is orchestrating this amazingly. And he's like celebrating Hashem's act in the moment that these people are torturing him. It's just a fascinating, and so he emulates that, and he by example, he shows how we can see that. So part of our work in the world is to peel back Elokim. And when we peel back Elokim, we reveal Havaya. We reveal the revelation of God. So again, Havaya, the name of expression of revelation of God, like Hawaii, right? Havaya. Havaya is revelation. Elokim is concealment. The exercise that we're confronted with every day is to peel back the Elokim, to basically go beneath the shield and the concealment of Elokim and break through that barrier and see the Havaya, right? So an example of that would be Elokim is the name of Hashem that creates nature, right? So in nature, God is concealed. You see the nature, you see the ocean, the sunrise, the trees, the birds, and it just seems to appear to be the sort of the natural order of things. This is just how things happen. Your first thought isn't this is happening in this moment by the hand of God. You just think this is the way. This is the sun rises and the ocean, the waves happen and things happen. So you have to sort of remember and bring into consciousness that this is happening by the divine hand in this moment. There's someone actually orchestrating this, right? There's a creator making this happen. When you do that in your consciousness, you're actually peeling away Elokim and you're revealing Havaya, right? So it's actually a very spiritual exercise because you're actually bringing Havaya and Elokim together. It's called a Yichud. Yichud Havaya Elokim means revealing the Havaya, the godliness within Elokim. Seeing the divine within nature is a spiritual exercise that happens in your consciousness. And when you do that, you become a channel for revealing godliness in the world, even if it's just in your own consciousness. So, okay, going back to the Shaka. There's a fascinating, so we spoke about the concept, the Kabbalistic concept of dinim, judgment, and the principle is ein hadinim nimtokin ele b'shorshon. Again, this is a Kabbalistic principle that says that if you want to sweeten the severity, the din is the severity, and nimtokim comes from the word matok. Matok in Hebrew means to sweeten. How do you sweeten the severity? Which means how do you take away the harshness of a severe situation, of a situation that's concealing godliness. You got to go to the root. You got to go to the source. The only way to sweeten it is to go to the source. In other words, if you can reveal that the source of this harshness, of this severity, of this concealment of godliness, which is appearing to be evil, which is appearing to be some harsh judgment, if you can go to the source and see that it's actually Hashem, that it's actually coming from the source, which is Hashem in this moment, then it can transform. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, in the book of Tanya, that when a person can see and realize in the moment that something that seems to be no good is ultimately from Hashem and that it's good in the moment, if you can believe it and see it and wrestle with that and trying to actually uncover the godliness in it, then on the revealed level, it will transform. In the moment that you can perceive it and see it as the hand of Hashem, it'll actually manifest that on a revealed level as well. So, going back to the name of Elokim, the Kabbalah says that one of the ways that peeling back the name of Elokim, which symbolizes severity, concealment, and divine judgment, is that we go to the letter that's before it. Okay? So I'm going to open up a siddur, just because I don't have a slideshow, unfortunately. But in a siddur, those of you that know Hebrew will be able to follow along, but I'll explain it. This is the chart of the Aleph Bet. Okay? The Aleph Bet is the Hebrew letters. Those of you that know it, fine. If not, you listen. The first letter is the Aleph. Now, you can't go back because there's nothing before it. So it'll stay, right? We want to go back to the letter that precedes each letter. So in the name of Elokim, you have the Aleph. You can't go back because there's nothing to go back, right? Now let's go to the Mem. The Mem, which is the final letter of Elokim, if you go back, what do you end up with? A Mem. Because there are certain final letters in Hebrew that are the same sound as the letter. So, for example, a nun, right? There's a nun, which is the N sound, and then there's a final nun. So it's the same sound, it's the same letter. One appears in the middle of a word as a nun, at the end of a word is the final nun. Same thing with the kaf and chaf. There's the final letter and there's the middle letter. So it's the same word that has two options. You'll see them over here as well. You have the fei and the en fei. So without getting too complicated, for those who are not familiar with Hebrew, the mem, there's the final mem, right, is that, and then there's the regular mem. So if you go back from the final mem, you land up with the regular mem. So you still have a mem, right? So in the name of Elokim, if we want to peel back and sort of undo the severity, which is this concept of retracting, sort of peeling away at the tzimtzum, at the concealment of godliness, right? That represents the name of Elokim, so that we can reveal some godliness, right? So we're going to go back a letter. We're going to take each letter and go back. So the Aleph and the Mem cannot go back anywhere because there's nothing before the Aleph, right? Sorry, 1 second. Nothing precedes the Aleph, so it stays the Aleph. And before the Mem, you have the regular Mem. So let's go back to other letters. The Lamed, which is like the L in Hebrew. If you go back, what do you land up with? The previous letter to the Lamed is the Chaf. Right? The Hey, if you go back, one letter is the Daled. And the Yud, if you go back a letter, is the Tet. So if we had to replace the name of Elokim with a letter previous, that would be a name of God that Kabbalah talks about, which is Achtadam, which you never heard of, which I also never heard of until a year or two ago. Achtadam is basically Aleph. Instead of a Lamed, we're going to have a Kaf. We're going to replace the Lamed with a Kaf. So it's Aleph Kaf. Instead of a Hey, we're going to replace it with a Daled. So it's Aleph Kaf Daled. And instead of a Yud, we're going to replace it with a test. So instead of Elo dash him, it'll be Tam. Aleph Chaf Daled Het Mem. It doesn't matter. The point is, what's the idea behind this? The idea is by going one letter earlier, right? We're trying to peel back at the severity of the name which Elokim represents. We're trying to remove the mask and the concealment of godliness by going back to its source, the letter previous, because of the concept that Ein Hadinim Nimtokin Ez B'Shoshon. If you want to reveal and you want to peel away at the concealment of godliness, you've got to go back to the source. Okay? So again, you have the 5 letters. Okay? Aleph, Lamed, Hey, Yud, Mem, Elokim. We want to go back a letter because we want to peel away at the severity, at the concealment of godliness. So the Aleph stays where it is because there's nothing before the Aleph, so it stays out. The Mem is still a Mem because it's the final Mem and the regular Mem. So those two fingers stay out because they don't get replaced. Which fingers can we retract? Which letters of Hashem can be retractable? The three letters which represent the Lamed, Hey, and the Yud are retractable because they can go back to the previous letter, which the physical act of putting your fingers in is the spiritual act of retracting those letters of Hashem, representing concealment and severity, and pulling it back to the previous letter. Okay? So the physical act of doing the Shaka represents retracting the three middle letters of the Lamed, Hey, Yud in the name of Elokim, and revealing, right, allowing the name of Hashem to be retracted so that there can be more flow of divine godliness, of revelation of godliness. So when a person is doing a Shaka, whether they're conscious of it or not, obviously they're doing away, hang loose, hey, chill, see you later, whatever, right? From a Kabbalistic point of view, if Levi Yitzchok was alive today, and he had to do the Shaka, the Kabbalist doing the Shaka, the intention would be, what we're doing right now is we're doing a kmitza, we're doing the biblical act of, elevating the flower in this sacred ritual called kmitza, of bringing something, elevating something towards Hashem, towards God. And what are we doing? We're taking something that represents the name Elokim, and we're trying to peel away and retract the Elokim, the severity, this concealment of godliness, by taking it back a step, because that's how you remove the concealment, is by peeling away at it and taking it to its source. And why are we only retracting the three middle fingers? Because those represent the letters Lamed, Hey, Yud in the name Elokim. And those are the only three letters which can go back a letter because there's a letter before it. That's different. And the representation and the intention and the meditation is that we're peeling away, we are retracting the name Elokim to sort of lessen the concealment of godliness, right? And essentially a revelation, allowing for more revelation, allowing for more Havaya. So why is it the symbol of Aloha? Because Elokim, which is really Elohim, right, is essentially, that's what Aloha comes from. Aloha is essentially the almost like a substitute or a formation of the name Elokim, right? And in doing this, we are working with the name Elokim, right? And there's a concept called Oved Elokim. Oved Elokim means simply, Oved means a servant. Oved Elokim is the one who serves God, right? A servant of God. But in Chassidus, the word for Oved also comes from another context. Someone who is a leather tanner, a tanner of leather, of hides, is called Oved Orot. Orot means, or could mean light in Hebrew with the Aleph, and or with the Ayin Vav Resh means leather, hide. Ibud Orot means to work with hide, means to soften it and treat it, to treat the leather, to make it usable as a product. So obviously, if your shoes are leather or your belt is leather, or you have some kind of leather bag, right, a woman's purse, the leather has to be treated in order to be usable as a product, right? So taking a hard leather and working with it and refining it is called Ibud Orot, La'abed. It's actually one of the 39 forbidden activities on Shabbat because it's a significant act. So Oved in Hasidic literature, Oved doesn't only mean to serve God, but Oved Elokim means to serve God literally on a pshat level, but on a sod level, on a secret level, means to work with, like a tanner works with the hide to make it refined, to work with the name Elokim and to refine it. How do you refine the name Elokim? It's God's name. How am I going to refine the name of God? Of course, this is God and this is me. But working with Elokim means to endeavor to reduce the concealment of godliness. And this is part of our work, our spiritual work in this world, is to endeavor to refine, meaning to say to peel away at Elokim, to lessen the concealment of godliness by introducing a higher level of consciousness and awareness of godliness in the world. And that's part of our work. So when we work with Elokim, which represents the name of Hashem that conceals godliness, like in nature or in situations which are harsh, and we peel away at Elokim, we actively retract the name Elokim in this biblical and mystical act of representing that we are peeling away, we are retracting the concealment of Elokim. What we're doing in that moment is we are working over Elokim, we are working with the name Elokim actively, and we are symbolizing with our hands and our actions a retraction, a pulling back, a peeling back of the harshness, of the severity, of the concealment of godliness, which essentially is an act which allows for godliness to flow in a more revealed way. So now we've come full circle, and we see how what seemingly is a simple act which every local person is doing, when we put on the lens of Reb Levi Yitzchok, because Yartzeit is today, and when we put on the lens of Kabbalah, we see that the Shaka is a kmitza. And the kmitza is a biblical symbol that goes back over 3,000 years, that God told Moses to tell Aaron, to tell his sons to do this act. And the Talmudic scholars discuss, I'm just recapping, and the Talmudic scholars discuss how do you do the kmitza, and they come to the conclusion that you, according to one opinion, you dip into the flour with your whole entire fist. According to another opinion, you just take the 3 middle fingers. But even according to the opinion in the Talmud that you put in your whole fist, you use your pinky and your thumb to wipe off the edges of the flour that's sticking out. That what remains is only what's in the middle 3 fingers. Comes along the Zohar and talks about the idea of the hand of Hashem representing the name Elokim, Aleph, Lamed, Hey, Yud, Mem. And the Talmudic, and the students of the Arizal, the Eitz Chaim, I think it's based on the Arizal Kabbalah, Lurianic Kabbalah, talks about this concept of the kmitza being aligned with Elokim, and the retraction of the 3 middle fingers being, so to speak, peeling back at Elokim, going back to the letter Aleph, Kaf, Daled, Tet, Mem, Tam, which is a Kabbalistic variation of Hashem's name. And so the Kabbalah of the Shaka being peeling back at the concealment of Elokim, allowing for the revelation of Havaya and the revelation of Hashem in the world more. So there we have it. It took us about an hour as opposed to half an hour that I was hoping to. But for those of you that stuck around, thank you very much. I'm gonna end the recording so that people who want to have the recording will have this class. But I'm going to open it up for questions. You can unmute yourself.